In this class, we've learned many high minded, aspirational, and enlightened moral ideals. The commitments to impartiality and reason, beneficence, justice, respect for persons and their autonomous choices, and what it takes to develop oneself into a morally virtuous person. We might agree that these ideals, or at least some combination of them, express the highest standard of ethical and moral behavior that a human being could hope to achieve. But are they realistic? Certainly, human beings can show respect for another, can respond to other suffering, and they can work toward establishing a more fair and equitable society. However, it is also certainly the case that human beings routinely fall short of these exalted moral ideals. Do these principles simply set the bar too high? Upon reflection, it may seem that there is a sense in which the principles of beneficence, justice, and respect for persons are unnatural for human beings. How easily do we find ourselves tempted to manipulate and deceive other people to get what we want? Ignore human suffering when we know we can mitigate it with the proper effort and attention, or take what belongs to another person for ourselves. In fact, based upon what we know about the origin of the human species, it seems it would be more likely for us to violate the Belmont Principles of beneficence, justice, and respect for persons than it would be for us to praise and follow them. We know that human nature is the product of a very long, gradual process of evolution by natural selection. Human nature is a concatenation of various innate biological tendencies that allowed our ancestors to win a ruthless battle for survival, or, as Darwin put it, the struggle for existence. Given all this, it might seem like a miracle that we ever act in an altruistic, impartial, and just fashion. Or, to ask an even deeper question, if human nature is the product of an evolutionary struggle that seems guided only by an ethic of survival of the fittest, then how could concepts like beneficence, justice, and respect for persons ever be understood by human beings in the first place? How could a human being ever come up with these high minded and exalted moral ideals? In this video and those which follow it, we will explore the evolutionary foundations of morality as well as consider how we can move beyond the primitive origins of human ethics. While evolution does prime us to be partial to our perceived in-group and hostile toward those perceived as the out-group, it also provides us with the capability for a limited altruism, a limited but real concern for the interests of other people. While these altruistic motivations begin within the confines of the family, they eventually make it possible for us to feel real concern for those in our town, city, state, country, even the entire world, and perhaps eventually all sentient beings, no matter what species they belong to. That at least is the ideal put forward by moral cosmopolitanism. Here we will begin to consider what sort of morality evolution has produced for the natural human being, and what steps we can take to progress toward a more universal and cosmopolitan ethic. In the introduction, I mentioned that the Belmont Principles of beneficence, justice, and respect for persons can be seen as cosmopolitan. But what does this mean? What is a cosmopolitan way of thinking about ethics? The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy gives the following definition of cosmopolitanism. The word cosmopolitan has been used to describe a wide variety of important views in moral and socio-political philosophy. The nebulous core shared by all cosmopolitan views is the idea that all human beings, regardless of their political affiliation, are or can and should be citizens in a single community. We can understand cosmopolitanism as a tendency found both in the moral sphere as well as the political sphere, which takes the concept of inclusion and universality to their final endpoint. That final endpoint is the state where we see all human beings, and perhaps all sentient beings, as part of a single moral community who all deserve equal moral consideration. It is important to recognize just how transformative this idea is. We are all born with various attachments and allegiances over which we have no control. We are born into a certain family, in a certain city and country, into a certain religion and culture, each with its own distinct ways of life. There are many things that divide and separate human beings from one another, and crucially, we naturally give our loyalty to these specific attachments. We naturally care more about those in our own family, our own country, or our own religion. Cosmopolitan thinking does not deny that this is the case, but it encourages us to move beyond these dividing lines in some sense. Cosmopolitan thinking encourages us to see our peers not primarily as members of this or that family, social class, religion, culture, town, city, or country, but rather as members of one inclusive human family. A classic statement of the cosmopolitan ideal can be found in the ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes the Cynic. When asked what country he was from, Diogenes declared that he was a citizen of the world. This statement suggests, of course, that his attachment to the human community, which spans the entire globe, is more important to him than whatever attachment he might have to his place of birth. For context, it is worth knowing that Diogenes was a rather unique individual. He was banished from his hometown for debasing the currency. After moving to Athens, he habitually criticized the common beliefs of his new fellow citizens. He saw his complete poverty as a virtue that he thought should be celebrated, and was known to sleep in a large ceramic jar in the Athenian marketplace. In fact, this is depicted in the painting by John William Waterhouse that was shown in the introduction to this video. Diogenes' iconoclasm and strange and odd quirks of character were seen as strange, even unnatural, by his fellow citizens, and his claim to be a citizen of the world would have been received in the same way. This speaks to an important point that we will explore here. It is much more natural and conventional to primarily identify ourselves with our particular birthplace or cultural community, our in-group, and to be suspicious, even hostile, to those we perceive as foreign or different, the perceived out-group. Inculcating a more cosmopolitan ethic, then, is difficult, it takes effort, and as we will see, requires resisting many of the natural dispositions implanted in our human nature. I have stated that the Belmont Principles of beneficence, justice, and respect for persons rely on a kind of cosmopolitan thinking. Why is this the case? First, we need to be clear about what kind of cosmopolitanism we are talking about. There are many different kinds of cosmopolitanism, but the two most prominent are moral cosmopolitanism and political cosmopolitanism. Political cosmopolitanism typically makes a claim about the legitimacy of political boundaries, the types of political boundaries that demarcate cities, states, and countries. One claim of the political cosmopolitan might be that such boundaries are illegitimate. Instead of having many particular countries, we should work toward having one world government of which each member of the human community would be a citizen. Whatever the merits or problems of such a proposal, that won't be our concern here. Instead, we will be concerned with moral cosmopolitanism. The philosopher Charles R. Beats describes this version of cosmopolitanism in his book Political Theory and International Relations. He states, "It is the notion that every human being has a global stature as the ultimate unit of moral concern. It applies to the whole world the maxim that choices about what policies we should prefer or what institutions we should establish should be based on an impartial consideration of the claims of each person who would be affected." Boiled down to its essence, moral cosmopolitanism claims that when we're making moral choices, the interests of all human beings matter and matter equally. All humans deserve equal moral consideration. Now, how do the Belmont Principles express this sort of thinking? Well, first, take the principle of beneficence, the idea that we should work to increase human happiness and reduce human suffering. Those who see this principle as primary, for instance, the utilitarians like John Stuart Mill, do not just see it as a duty we have towards some particular subset of humans. Rather, it is a duty to reduce human suffering and meet human need as such. The principle of beneficence does not see any individual human being's suffering as any more important or worthy of attention than that of anyone else's. What about the principle of justice? Justice relies heavily on an ethic of impartiality. When deciding how the benefits and burdens of living together should be distributed, it is vital that we use some commonly accepted principles that are applied equally to all people and all citizens. Finally, there's the principle of respect for persons. Previously, we said that the ideal of respect for persons is closely related to our concept of human rights. Kant believed that there is a certain duty to show respect for all human beings merely because of their status as rational beings. This undergirds the idea that there are certain moral and political rights that all human beings warrant and deserve, regardless of any differentiating characteristics about them. For instance, their gender, race, religion, political affiliation, or cultural background, etc. As such, each of the Belmont Principles contains a vital and important aspect of cosmopolitan thinking. If the ideal of moral cosmopolitanism is in some sense not completely natural for the human species, then we need to ask, how can this ideal become a reality? While the ideal of moral cosmopolitanism has certainly never been perfectly inculcated or followed in any human culture or in any period of time, and while some would argue that complete and total cosmopolitanism should not really be our aim, it is at least a goal that we can recognize, understand, and take steps toward achieving. So the question is, how is achieving that goal possible? Newton explains that this is one of her main goals in this chapter is to answer this question. She states, one of the aims of this chapter is to build the explanatory structures that will bridge the human nature we find and the human person we want to bring into being and to help flourish. Furthermore, Newton notices that in providing this explanation, we must first realize that moral cosmopolitanism is somewhat foreign to our human nature. Nowhere in the human genome, she states, is there an impulse to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Now, why do we need to know this? Why is it important to be honest about the reality of our human nature? Newton explains that before we start preaching the gospel of hope, faith, and charity and the Belmont Principles, we need to know what we're up against. If we want people to be altruistic, we are going to have to set up the community mechanisms and institutions that will encourage and reward this virtue. If extensive altruism, a concern for justice, and a commitment to equality are not built into our human DNA, then achieving these aims will require, at least to some extent, some sort of conscious and deliberate effort. Our purpose here will be to think about what kind of effort this endeavor requires. Specifically, what kinds of mechanisms and institutions do we need to move from human nature as we find it to a more extensive and universal moral cosmopolitanism? The first step in answering this question will be to further explore the original nature and circumstance of the human being. Of course, human nature has been and continues to be fundamentally shaped by evolution through natural selection. As Newton points out, evolutionary biology is one of the few disciplines that can contribute to our understanding of the natural, unschooled human. So we should first say something about how evolution works in shaping the origin of biological species. Newton gives the following general account. In a world where a constant tendency to overpopulation of all species exists, some will survive and some will not, and those creatures whose genetic composition gives rise to traits that are best adapted to the environmental demands, say longer necks on hoofed creatures like giraffes who live on the leaves of trees, will survive and pass those genes to the next generation. Shorter necked giraffes may not. Over the generations, we will find giraffes with longer and longer necks up to a point. But it is not enough to survive. The giraffe must also mate, produce offspring, and raise those offspring to sexual maturity if the genes are to persevere for more than a generation. Giraffes disinclined to mate or unable to raise offspring will not supply genes to future generations. According to evolutionary theory, the reason we see animals that have physical features that seem to fit their natural environment is that those animals that had more advantageous traits were able to survive, mate, and pass on their genes. Those that were not as well adapted to the environment were outcompeted, did not survive long enough to reproduce, and went extinct. Speaking generally, from this it follows that if we want to know why the human being has some particular characteristic or trait, then we need to ask, what survival advantage did that characteristic or trait afford the human being in its natural environment? Importantly for our purposes, evolution does not just explain the presence of certain physical features of animals. It also explains certain behavioral tendencies. Newton provides the following example. When an adult healthy male lion comes upon a pride of lions not related to himself, a pride consists of a dominant male, several lionesses, and their cubs, he tends to challenge the dominant male for possession of the pride. If he wins, he drives off the once dominant male and proceeds to kill all the cubs. That brings all the lionesses into heat, so he mates them and thereafter protects them and their cubs from other male lions. Now, this is rather violent behavior, then immediately followed by protective behavior, a seemingly odd combination. So why does the lion engage in that kind of behavior? And why is this behavior seen as something positive in a mate by the lionesses? Newton gives the following evolutionary explanation of this phenomenon. The male lion has a behavioral disposition, undoubtedly innate. How would he have learned it to do all these things? The objective result, no matter what he wants or intends, is that the cubs of that pride will have his genes rather than the former lions. Since innate dispositions are encoded in the genes, there's a strong probability that his male cubs will have the same dispositions, and that gene pool will slowly come to dominate the lion population in that region. Now, there are two important points to make about this explanation. First, it is sometimes popular to think that the struggle for existence that characterizes the evolutionary story is one in which individual animals are fighting to survive. But that actually is not quite right. The lion and every other animal is going to die at some point. No animal can live on generation after generation. Rather, what is passed on into the future is not the individual lion himself, but his genes. The reason the lion engages in this behavior is not primarily because it helps him to survive. It may actually put his life in grave danger. Rather, it is because it increases the probability that his genes will survive into the next generation long after he has died. Second, while the result of the lion's actions is that his genes survive into the next generation, this is not what the lion is intending through his actions. The lion does not have a desire that his genes live on to the next generation. The lion does not even know what a gene is. It is just that lions who act in this way tend to pass on their genes and thus propagate more lions who will act this way in the future. This is an important point, particularly when we talk about the evolution of human beings. As we will see, care for our children can be given an evolutionary explanation insofar as caring for children increases the likelihood that our genes will survive into the future, since it affords our children with the opportunity to reproduce themselves. However, we might say that cannot be right. When I am up in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. giving my baby a bottle, I'm not thinking about the survival of my genes at all. I'm doing it because I love my child. Now, it is true that parents do love their children, but the question is, where did that tendency of self-sacrifice come from? While parents do not intentionally engage in care of their children because they consciously want to propagate their genes, it is still the case that the evolutionary basis of this tendency is that parental care increases the likelihood of our genes being transmitted into the future. Already we are seeing how evolution has shaped human morality. Despite the fact that evolution does involve a competitive struggle for existence, it also equips us with certain tendencies to act in self-sacrificial ways that serve to propagate our genes. Newton explains how the willingness to sacrifice for the sake of the group can bring about an evolutionary advantage. Does a willingness to sacrifice one's own interest for the welfare of the group have any evolutionary credentials? Approached by a bear or an enemy, if the young men will stand their ground and fight, the chances of keeping their genes, or what is the same thing, the genes of their families, in the next generation are vastly improved. Even if the fight is against a much larger group of the enemy, and therefore not to be won, the work of the warriors may delay the enemy long enough for the women and children, the actual bearers of the genes, to get to a place of safety. At least the probabilities lean in that direction. The earliest anthropologists noted the behavior of bees, where a designated group of guards or warriors will instantly attack any invader to the hive, even though a bee cannot sting without sacrificing her life. That tendency to attack and sting, regardless of the cost to the individual, is clearly innate. There are then cases where self-sacrifice for the larger whole, even self-sacrifice that may almost certainly lead to one's death, will serve to transmit one's genes by enabling the survival of one's children and other family members. As mentioned previously, the ethic of self-sacrifice can be seen as largely originating within the family. Newton again explains this point. Within the bosom of the family, an ethic of avoiding harm and beneficence must prevail, or the family will go out of existence. No human being can live apart from all others. Humans need social support just to survive, whatever the situation of physical resources might be. The ethic of self-sacrifice begins here, as all the family's resources are dedicated to the one most in need. The fact that it is the group most closely linked by genetics that exemplifies the strongest ethic of mutual support explains, or is explained by, the evolved dedication to the preservation of the group's genes. It is then this evolved dedication to the preservation of our genes which explains the origin of our rudimentary human morality. A morality which above all prizes those dispositions, sometimes selfish and sometimes self-sacrificial, which allow for our continued influence on the gene pool. At present, we should emphasize the following. While evolution does give us the capacity for self-sacrifice, it does so in a rather limited fashion. It is self-sacrifice on behalf of our group or our family, or more accurately, our own genes. This, of course, leaves open the distinct possibility that our natural concern for the interests of those in a perceived outgroup will be significantly weaker. And of course, it just is that prejudice towards those in an outgroup which is one of the main obstacles to inculcating a form of moral cosmopolitanism. Taking these points together, we can give the following explanation of the kind of morality that evolution equips human beings with. Let's call this human evolutionary morality. Newton explains that on the hypothesis or assumption that the survival of one's gene pool is a good thing, we are in a position to say that behavior that results in survival, in successful propagation and rearing of offspring is right for any member of a species. As we sometimes put it, evolution favors behavior that is conducive to survival. Most behavior and dispositions to behavior have a genetic component, so survival-oriented behavior favors and preserves the genes of the group that engages in it. The morality that evolution provides for human nature is one which praises those actions and tendencies that contribute to the survival of our genes, that ensure that our genetic line will continue into the future. As we progress further on this topic, then, there are two questions that we will need to pursue when we're thinking about human evolutionary morality. The first question we need to ask is this: how closely does human evolutionary morality approximate what we take to be an enlightened view of morality? In order to know how much work there is to do to approach moral cosmopolitanism, we need a conception of where we are starting from. If an enlightened view of ethics is one that is concerned about the suffering of the entire species and sees all human beings as individuals worthy of respect, then how far away from that ideal is the rudimentary moral code implanted in our nature by evolution, which we are starting with? The second question that we'll need to look at is the following. How can we progress beyond human evolutionary morality toward that more enlightened and cosmopolitan ethics? If our natural human morality is too prejudicial and not sufficiently universal, which I think there are good reasons to think that it is, and if we want to progress beyond this, then we need to know what steps we can take to make that happen. Perhaps more fundamentally, we need to know whether this is possible at all. Are human beings locked into a view of life which is concerned only with the propagation of our own genes? Despite what we like to tell ourselves about the need for equality, toleration, and concern for all human suffering, are we really all just beset by prejudice and partiality that will inevitably cause us to turn a blind eye toward those we perceive as different? Or can we move beyond this original state toward higher ideals that conceive of all human beings as part of one human community and one human family that are worthy of our moral concern?